school becomes, my opinion at that point, somewhere that's kind of scary to be. I know that I go to school, my emotions are going to be, looked at or pried into, and I'm not sure if I want to do that today. And I'm not sure if I feel ready to even think about that or do that. Why can't I just play with my friends at recess and just do the fun science project and the Halloween costume, you know,
Mm,
contest that
mm,
they had last week during Halloween? Why can't I
yeah.
just do that? I'm not feeling like I want to go. School becomes another place that's just, for using a word I don't like very much anymore, but I think it fits. It's just emotionally unsafe.
Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Everybody, we're back. We're continuing our discussion on this brilliant book by Abigail Shrier, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Good to see you guys again. How about we start with chapter 7? We're discussing chapter 7, chapter 8. Chapter 7, hunting, fishing, mining, mental health survey, mischief. And then we will go over to chapter 8, full of empathy and mean as hell. Okay, Michael,
Sure.
the floor
So,
is yours.
chapters in chapter 7, Abigail Shrier, she's continuing to examine the information gathering apparatus that is surrounding kids. This has really
Mm,
become kind of the through line of parts of her thesis, I suppose, as she's been looking at the school system and the intensified therapization of
mm,
school in general.
mm,
Um, she started it off, and most of the chapter is comprised of looking at the issue of surveys, um, at looking at what have classically been federally protected pieces of information under the auspices of organizations like the CDC. And among her major contentions in the chapter that we'll have to fan out here is that kind of similar to her earlier chapters on iatrogenesis, that these surveys run the risk of maybe inspiring or activating dysfunction through normalizing things like family conflict,
mm,
suicidality, self-harm, and even copycat behaviors. Um, and it kind of, this is something that in training, when you're learning to develop your own questions about surveys, and learning to develop your own research questions, it opens the question of like, what's your motivation fundamentally behind what it is that you're doing? And I think Schreier opens up this question for me, at least initially, of what is it that they're doing with these surveys? So kids are coming into school, is what she's saying, and they're receiving these surveys that are automatically perceived to have consent, if there is
mm,
nobody who is pushing back on whether or not they have consent to give these surveys to children. Um, I'm trying to make sense of, as I'm reading this chapter, what is the intention here? What kind of data collection apparatus are we involved in here? What is the
mm,
purpose? And I got a bit of a
mm.
sinister tone here, as I have throughout, much of the book. Um, and that's really where she started us off. So the somewhat almost commonplaceness of checking in on things like employees, children, and the well-being of individuals, but then asking them very pointed and intrusive questions, to gather whatever information it is that they're trying to gather here.
Yeah,
I think there's,
yeah.
I think two particular points really hit home with me that I'll mention right now. The
Hmm.
first one is the increase in the idea for children, maybe so the question is, for example, do you harm yourself, or do you ever have feelings, where you wish you do not want to be here anymore, or feelings that you want to kill yourself? One part of this is the increase in the idea that that's a possibility, that that's an
Hmm.
option, right? So suicidality, self-harm becomes an option. It also attaches to this kind of trendy way of thinking, that it's kind of cool in some ways to do this now. It's cool
Hmm.
to have trauma and to go to school and to have other kids talking about all that, right? This has become something that um, isn't necessarily the best way to approach assessing a child's well-being. I think that's one piece. The other piece of it is that school can be an escape for these kids. When you have a lot of trauma and you have things happening at home, school, by just the way that it's structured, can be some type of a solace or a place of respite for some child who's actually suffering at home with a great deal of trauma and a great deal of conflict, school, sports, things like that may actually take a child out of that headspace for, 8 hours a day or whatever it is, and actually, increase some self-esteem or self-worth by actually participating in the class. So, I mean, those 2 points, I think, out of all the excellent points that she makes and out of all of the questions that she lists here, as examples, what strikes me the most is those 2 potentials, and then running into trouble with those 2 potentials. Both the idea that, hey, this is something that's an option if I don't feel so great, and the idea that it's trendy. There's other kids that feel this way, so let's go off and be depressed together. We had a suicide pact group once when I was when I was running a counseling center at a school, and the suicide pact was among a group of friends. Nobody wanted to say who was in the pact. We sort of figured it out on our own. It took a long time to do that. Half of them ended up in the hospital. So there's that component. And then again, this sort of third component where school in many ways can be for certain children a way to escape and find a level of self-agency and confidence that they may not have when they're at home or in other situations. So I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts about other parts of the book? Those are kind of what popped out to me.
No,
Yeah.
I think those points are relevant throughout the book. That sense of inducement by placing a child in the exposure of kind of scenario.
Yes.
And one of the I don't know, maybe it's become a dogmatic supposition in our field, and we've talked about this in at least one of our previous episodes when we were talking about children being assessed. I think in one of the earlier chapters, she discussed bringing her child in for a medical appointment with a stomach ache, and I think I felt compassion in the fear that she described around, being asked to step out of the room and the child going through what I can only imagine was something like, like a Columbia, looking into, if there's been any sort of suicidal ideation, but that not being part of why the kid was there in the first place. I think what she's speaking to here is there a possibility of kind of this coachability in bringing kids into a space, as you said, that where something is popularized, where it's not just normalized or destigmatized, but typified in the experience that a child might be having, and can we exacerbate that to some degree? And are we choosing in some sense, the wrong error to try and correct for? Where error one might be, if we don't assess, we might miss the possibility that this is going on for kids. So we should assess everybody just to make sure we catch every instance that this could possibly occur. Error two being that if no one's thinking about it at all, or the great majority aren't, and there's people who would be susceptible to thinking about things like suicide or self-harm with an activation, let's just say, some form of inducement, then, running that risk as well. And I think we're finding ourselves now at the question point, are we trying to come up with are we coming up with totalizing interventions, ways of data mining, ways of getting information about people that are running that second risk?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there a point?
What is also
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Jaco.
what was interesting to me was that this was almost federally mandated. It was almost like this was what was supposed to happen, which is quite worrying. Just to give us some context, just to give a few examples of the kind of questions that these surveys ask. For instance, she mentions here the 2021 and 2023 youth risk behavior surveys, also authored by the CDC, asks middle school children, how old were you when you had sexual intercourse for the first time? So there's this assumption that this could have happened. Middle school children, right? But then look at these options. Okay, I've never had sexual intercourse, all right. 8 years old or younger. 9 years old, 10 years old, 11, 12, 13 years old or older. The expectation created, the possible worlds created by authority figures. That is your point. It just speaks to your point, Christine, that it plants possible ways of living that we could spare our children from, right? Not only in terms of sexual behavior, but also in terms of things like what you mentioned, suicidality, drug use, other strange practices, which could plant the suggestion that those behaviors could be engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sounds like a type of institutional grooming to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think it's important to scope out and also mention that there are certain settings, circumstances where questions like these might be more applicable than others. If you're working in an environment, let's say a lower SES environment, you might be constrained by a different set of variables than you might see in, let's say, if we're in your typical public high school in California, whatever typical means for California. And so I think it's important that we're taking a step back to see that in framing, as I often have described it in our work so far together on this. What I mean by in framing is these automatic assumptions about what somebody may have experienced, or what is typical, or what may be part of their experience, often leaving out a negotiation for nuance, for meaning making, for the possibility that somebody has had a completely different set of experiences that inform what is normative to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so these questions being imposed on everyone, I don't know that there's any evidence that these are statistically prevalent to the point that they're the right questions to be asking everyone
Yes.
in a school setting in
Yeah.
particular.
I think that's the
Yeah.
key, is that it's in a school setting and it's everyone, those 2 points, because, I did suicide assessment for kids 12 through 17 as a part of some of my clinical experience from years and years ago. These almost look like questions that we would be asking them. But at that point, when they would come in, they were already in a mental health crisis, and we were already in a situation where they needed assessment to assess whether they were stable enough to either A, go home with their parents again, or B, be transferred into an inpatient unit to receive further, more intensive care. So that was appropriate in that sense. And it's interesting when you say the words, what age were you when you had sex, or what age were you when you drank alcohol. The assumption is that you have. And what I find interesting about that is, with addiction work, which I've brought up before, there's just some overlaps, I think, here. With addiction work, you're sort of taught to always ask the question, how many drinks do you have per week? How many times do you use marijuana or pot or whatever? The idea is that you're assuming in an addiction situation that the person does do it. So the
That's it.
question is formed in a way in which it's not, do you drink? It's, how much do you drink? And this is the same tactic that they use in questionnaires like this that make it, I think, all the more dangerous or questionable at the very least.
Yeah, that's circular questioning. It presumes the existence of.
Mhm.
But also, again, to your point, you administered these questionnaires because they were indicated.
Yes,
From the
because
presentation
Right.
of the patients, they were indicated. You
Correct.
can't assume, or well, it's not ethical to just through the bench administer these questionnaires to all children,
yes,
whether these questionnaires were indicated or not. Precisely for
yes,
that reason, because some of these questions are circular, presuming the existence of.
yes, absolutely.
And at bare minimum, it turns into this approach of trying to cast a wide net to catch as many different possible issues, problems as you can. And as we've discussed through this book, the possibility of somebody maybe seeing dysfunction where previously they hadn't, and suddenly having an effective response to that, a negative response to that, as a result, I think is really part of what's underlying some of her concerns here. Is very similar to what we've been discussing throughout the book so far. Is are we inflating something that otherwise wouldn't have been perceived by the individual, or made into or perceived as negative by the individual, into something that's potentially negative?
Yeah,
So how about we steelman this?
Okay.
yes.
Why do you think, from the CDC's perspective and also from these state governments' perspective, why do you think, would they say, do they administer these tests through the bench?
Well, I think they're trying to make a case for trauma-informed care schools, where the entire school, SEL and trauma-informed care, I think they're trying to make a case for both of those so that these programs can be brought in. Now, these programs
see.
were developed, right, by groups of people. There is some sort of financial, I have to say, with CRT, right, critical race theory, very broadly, there was an article that I had found that wasn't in the mainstream, but was mainstream enough, where the administration, the Department of Education, said we're no longer, and this is happening in the state of Arizona, we're no longer going to fund school lunches for you unless you introduce this curriculum into the classroom and into the discussion and into, you know, the lesson plan. We won't pay for school lunches. So in those situations, you know, these administrators were put in the unfortunate position of having to decide what's more important: feeding these kids their basic necessities, such as food, especially for kids who came from homes where maybe there wasn't, you know, anybody there to prepare a lunch, or maybe they didn't have access to food. And so that was used as a tool, a mechanism to try to get these states that were trying to push back to abide. Specifically, Arizona is the one that I had read about. And so that's very sinister. That to me says what greater, to use the word apparatus, is at work here that's bringing all of this SEL and trauma-informed care into the communities. What are we trying to do with these students and with these kids? There's clearly
Yeah.
a motivation and an agenda. And at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I think a lot of it has to do with the broader apparatus we have that maintains and looks after and even micromanages the education that's happening in the districts and in the states altogether. The Department of Education is very massive now, and there's questions whether or not it should even be something that's an actual department that's federally funded, and whether or not things should go back to where states are just in control. Now, this is the US, right? So this is different in other parts of the world, I would imagine. But I think you could make a case for there being some kind of agenda to bring the SEL and to bring the trauma-informed care into the classes. And you do that by proving 80% or 85% of these students feel that they have, you know, thoughts of self-harm 5 times a week, and 75% of them are having sex already, and etc. The list goes on and
Okay.
on.
So to justify the extent of government overreach.
In my opinion, it's to justify the extent of government overreach. That's what I love about Jaco. You can make things so articulate in just one phrase.
That's just fine. No,
and that's exactly what I was getting.
Right. Keep going. No, go on.
Well,
Michael.
you know, to your point of how do we steel man this? Now, if we're thinking about it on an institutional level, it's very easy to distort the individuals that are involved in these processes to begin with. I think if we take a look at the assumptions that are embedded in some of these surveys, it may actually point to the fact that they actually assume that these resources already are needed, and that they are looking to find ways, metrics to prove that their services are needed, even at the individual level, going up to the institutional level. And so, with the automatic assumption that these, you know, forms of harm, dysfunction, mental illness, whatever they're assessing for, because there's quite a few surveys that she goes over here. They're not all of the same.
Quite a few.
Right. And I wonder if, you know, just for people who are pushing these surveys forward, if they do believe they're doing something in the service of those who maybe are, you know, the word marginalized is quite thrown out quite often now, of the marginalized who don't have a way to speak for themselves. Because what's interesting about this is, in order to make these surveys something that they could do, they all had to be anonymous, is my understanding from Shrier, that the information acquired has to be anonymous. So there's no follow-up with the individual. So it's not to the benefit of the individual here necessarily. And I think that's where that concern of this gets them resources and therefore they do X, Y, and Z can come in. And I think that's part of the equation. I think the other part of the equation is that automatic assumption that these things are widespread, that dysfunction is widespread, and that we need to find a way to show that. We need to find a way to show that fundamentally.
And to catch them early.
And to catch them early. Right.
So is that a form of grooming in a sense then?
Well, I think I think it could end up as a form of grooming if the process of catching them early has iatrogenic effects of almost producing the problems.
Where there may have not been one, or it may not
Or
have
there
been
may
as
not.
severe.
And you see, and that's not being controlled for. That that's I don't see the extent of caution this kind of practice deserves.
Right, because the cart's before the horse here. They're already, engaging in practices that run with the assumption that they're going to find these myriad forms of dysfunction, whether it's or pain, let's just say, whether it's, depression, anxiety, self-harm, feelings of shame. I mean, again, it's quite a list of different ways that these surveys lay themselves out. The infrastructure is already there, so that when the data is acquired, they can legitimize their activities, Christine, to your point. And at the same time, I want to hold on to the possibility that they've convinced themselves that in doing this, they are helping kids at an individual level, even though they've made it completely anonymous, by putting grand sweeping, totalizing interventions out there for people ahead of time, without paying attention to the possibility that they're actually inducing the pain themselves, and engaging in those different forms of intervention.
So what are you guys making of these questionnaires snooping into the private lives of families?
I mean, I think it's more destructive. I mean, again, it's all about the context and where this is happening. These can be extremely valuable. If you have somebody that's a young child that's come in, I used to work with the 12 to 17-year-olds on a psychiatric hold, and we're needing to figure out, this kid just came in, they had already been cutting their wrists. Okay, we already know that's an issue. We need to find out more. When does this happen? How often does this happen? What is triggering this? What are the issues at home that could be, a part of this whole picture? In a mental health, inpatient or assessment center type of context, that's where it belongs. That makes sense to me, because we do need to do these assessments. That's what it's about. Not in the classroom where you have 35 plus students sometimes with a teacher administering these kinds of tests or asking these questions where they're anonymous. As you said, Michael, there's no way to even follow up on the kid that might have said something that was very disturbing. And it actually interrupts what they're there to do, which is to learn math, science, writing, what other history, what other subjects there are. These kinds of things can open up an emotional floodgate that can be very difficult to put back up and put back together and to contain. And then we have no guardrails, right? We've used this term a lot, I think, here, talking about guardrails and having some containment. And this absolutely destroys the ability to do that, because now we've got kids that are reliving trauma. We've got kids that are maybe feeling left out because they didn't have that kind of trauma. So now we've got all sorts of emotional explosions happening, and there's nothing there to hold that, to contain that, to make meaning of it, to understand it, to work with it, to work through it. And there, the whole school day is gone now, right? Because we spent the better part of the day trying to have circles. Now we circle up. Remember, a few chapters back, or even a chapter back, to circling up. Now we get to circle up, and see if we can kind of, calm these kids down a bit and whatnot. So then school becomes, my opinion at that point, somewhere that's kind of scary to be. I know that I go to school, my emotions are going to be, looked at or pried into, and I'm not sure if I want to do that today. And I'm not sure if I feel ready to even think about that or do that. Why can't I just play with my friends at recess and just do the fun science project and the Halloween costume, contest that they had last week during Halloween? Why can't I just do that? I'm not feeling like I want to go. School becomes another place that's just, for using a word I don't like very much anymore, but I think it fits. It's just emotionally unsafe.
Emotionally unsafe. Keep going.
Well, something that occurred to me while Christine was talking was just that the mainstay of our profession in psychology, in mental health, is, for me, summed up in the phrase, "it depends." And "it depends" does not come up you know, particularly clearly necessarily in this book. And I'd say it depends. As I was thinking about who might be susceptible to these surveys, it's like, well, it depends. But like maybe I could come up with a client that would be particularly susceptible to these surveys in a particular way, having a negative response to it. You know, if you've ever worked with somebody, let's say, with obsessive compulsive disorder, and you know, there are many subcategories of obsessive compulsive disorder, something like concerns like harm OCD, being afraid that one, you know, perseverating on the possibility that one might harm themselves if they were to suddenly lose control of their faculties and their inhibition. And to put a survey in front of them that reminds them of that core concern for themselves, of that concern that they are consistently thinking on, that individual might have a completely different reaction from somebody who, a kid who's like, oh, another one of these surveys, and is kind of a nerd to it, and is saying, you know what, I want to just get past this so I can get back to, I don't know, playtime, recess, the whatever we were doing before, playing on my phone, depending on the school and what, you know, what's allowed there. And so we have two very different profiles in terms of what's at stake for that individual. And to throw these surveys out and expect that nobody would be affected by it, that seems like a dogmatic position. But I also wouldn't want to make the mistake of saying, throwing these surveys out and potentially resourcing programs that could be beneficial without having looked at what the programs do and how effective they are. I wouldn't want to go as far as to say, well, they're completely, you know, not helpful at all, and that they couldn't have a benefit. The question becomes at the individual level. For
Yeah.
me,
That's the point. That's the point.
yes.
Is it indicated? Is it called
Is it
for?
indicated?
It's funny
And
because when my students would ask me questions about hypothetical situations, my answer, 9 times out of 10, I'd have an answer, but my first answer would be, it just depends.
It
That
depends.
I used to say, it was a broken record. I used to say constantly, and then we discussed in great detail, of course, but it depends. That's the thing. This isn't doing that, right? These are widespread, and it's for everybody, regardless of
yeah.
whether it's indicated.
And also the blurred lines. You know, there's got to be a boundary between private and public life, boundary between
Yes.
home life and school life. So there's a blurring of lines when they start prying into private, you know, into private ways of living. Like you said, what gets activated, what gets exposed is also uncontained because those teachers do not have the training. The kind of worms they open might not be contained again. And then also the exposure to the possibility of decompensation, like you said. It's you know, they catch fire like that. You know, the whole practice could be traumatizing in the real sense of the word, or you could actually induce, like she says here, the virality of something like suicide, or the virality of something like drug use, the curiosity you create. It could induce a behavioral pandemic of some sort if you're not cautious.
Right. I think she compared it to the DARE initiatives and trying to reduce the likelihood that children would use substances, which she talked about earlier in the book. And she does a little bit of comparative psychology to some degree here. She goes, well, if we take a look at that time period and the aftermath, the possibility that people were starting to use substances because they were being exposed to the idea in these initiatives, is it possible that we're doing the same thing here? And I think the answer is, yeah, it's possible. But it's something that we need to be able to be open and scrutinize openly as a professional community, as a community generally.
Absolutely.
So, shall we go on to chapter 8?
Yeah, I think it ties in
Chapter 8.
beautifully to what we were talking about.
Yeah, full of empathy and mean as hell. So she starts off this chapter by discussing a case that was actually a court case of a girl, you know, a high performer for a student, and they were on a campus somewhere, and this girl and her friends were just a bit geeky, bit nerdy, and they were playing around with words, you know, silly little jokes as adolescents sometimes resort to. And all in good spirit, all in good faith. And then she decided that she was going to post some of these questions or some of these jokes on I think it was Instagram or some social media site. And then some felt offended. And
Mhm.
because of the offense, all hell broke loose. And what she says here, several of the accusers admitted that they had not seen the offending post, and no administrator had bothered to read its text, according to the complaint. The hurt feelings of Chloe's accusers sufficed, their pain, proof of positive harm. And that just sets the scene for the rest of a discussion of brittle monsters. She says here, she speaks of some parents and people giving feedback on what this has led to, and one person says it creates unbelievable narcissists.
Mm.
Right, this culture, this mindset of, when someone cries wolf or when someone cries harm, you believe them, and they set the stage of how to treat the supposed offender. And then she goes over to the problem with empathy, which is also quite interesting. This Yale professor's opinion on empathy, and that empathy doesn't necessarily create kind people.
Mhm.
Yes, and maybe we can elaborate on that. So yeah,
Certainly.
that's
I
just
mean,
a brief
mhm.
summary. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, as she was talking about empathy, I was thinking back as
Mm.
empathy is defined as a moral emotion, as a pro-social, positively valenced moral emotion, of which there are several. There's disgust, guilt, anger can also be a moral emotion. Um, there's contempt, and so we tend to look at empathy almost as if it's like this idyllic uh, idol. It's an idol in some sense of moral emotions to aspire to. But she talks about it quite well here, and I think there's plenty of evidence to support this, that empathy has a dark side to it as well. When empathy is activated in response to a particular group, so one's in group,
Yes.
it can also give rise to an avarice to anyone who's perceived to be part of an out group.
Yes.
And here, I mean, this is a perfect case where we see that form of ostracization that took place under the guise of, well, this is the empathic, compassionate thing to do, is to, we've all been hurt and harmed by this offense. And so now we need to create this stunning coalition of moral virtues, stating that we're not going to stand for this. It's not an overstep. It's not perceived as an overstep, somebody making a joke and it going too far. It was perceived as almost like intentional harm. And it's a
Yes.
conflation that I think she's describing here between what is somebody who maybe stepped too far or made a mistake or stepped on the sensibilities of someone else with the idea of harm, that you've now done harm to the collective here in some sense. And it's a misapplication of the notion of empathy, because empathy is not a given. Empathy is activated and predicated on what I know about you that I can align with, that I can sync up with, that I can feel stepping into your shoes. And here, I'm not even sure that empathy is really what these kids are necessarily relying on. It reminds me of the burn book from Mean Girls, where the whole school just falls into absolute chaos over this book. And they're also mean to each other behind closed doors anyway. And
Yes.
they have to have their own feelings circle of sorts
Yes.
to be able to work past that. But there is a dark side to empathy, particularly as it pertains to in-group and out-group behavior. And I think we see a pretty prominent example right here. I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah. I think what the Yale professor says, to go back to that, was a very good point. He had said, this is Professor Paul Bloom, this makes us care more about them, empathy he's talking about, but it leaves us insensitive to the long-term consequences of our acts and blind as well to the suffering of those who we do not or cannot empathize with. Empathy is biased, pushing us in the direction of parochialism, I cannot say this word, and racism.
Parochialism, yeah.
Parochialism. Thank you. So I thought that was
And
very
racism.
powerful. Yes, and racism. So I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, this thing about empathy, I have a problem with the expression or the category of moral emotions. There's nothing inherently moral to empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Inherently moral. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing inherently moral to guilt. With
Mm-hmm.
all these emotions, you have to precede it with it depends.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on why you're feeling empathy, what the motivations are, what the rationality is behind your empathy, even with your guilt or even with shame. There's no such thing as something that is inherently moral in terms of
Mm-hmm.
emotions. It is as instinctive as aggression or as sexual
Mm-hmm.
attraction.
Mm-hmm.
But in today's environment of victimhood valor and of saviorship and of vindictive protectivism, to use Jonathan Haidt's expression, vindictive protectivism, only in such a banal, almost feral society where emotions in their pure form get elevated to moral status, could empathy be in itself regarded as moral, or compassion by itself be regarded as inherently moral, whereas it isn't.
Mm.
It just isn't. It
It's
depends.
not.
Like
It's not
even with
inherently
aggression, think about aggression. You can say that a surgeon operating on a body is enacting aggression. So is aggression
Yes.
in itself immoral? It depends.
It depends.
Right. Depends.
If you use aggression as contained and as targeted as surgery, then aggression is life-saving.
Yeah, that's right.
The same with empathy. It depends.
Yes.
If you are empathic towards a psychopath, a narcissistic, antisocial psychopath, just because you're empathic doesn't mean that your empathy is moral. And the same with these little monsters parents and teachers are colluding with. These are the very, very little monsters that will grow up eventually becoming the antisocial, manipulative psychopaths. So empathy is not in itself, or compassion is not in itself immoral. Moral. It can be immoral too. That's why we have phenomena like Stockholm syndrome or battered wife syndrome,
Yes.
because of the misapplication of empathy and compassion.
Yes.
And so maybe we could say to some degree, these emotions are just like any other emotion. They're kind of reflexive in relationship to the held beliefs and
Yeah.
shared narratives amongst individuals, particularly in this case where there's a group dynamic at play, that maybe make it kind of a mediating effect of a litmus test, an internal litmus test of whether or not the narrative is being adhered to. But it doesn't mean that the narrative necessarily is to the benefit of everybody, or that the beliefs are. And so that empathy, that tendency towards this compassionate connection and understanding can easily be subverted by a set of rules that constrain the way in which it's allowed to be expressed, the circumstances under which it's allowed to be expressed. So for instance, seeing everybody as a victim and needing to protect victims, but completely missing the entire context of the interaction. It's funny, this came up a little bit with the restorative justice circles when people were being asked to apologize to, let's say, their own attacker. That's what she was describing. The circumstances in which two people, if they were engaged in an altercation, let's say a physical altercation, were being asked to essentially apologize to each other because, and I think the reason for that is they couldn't derive context. They didn't know how things really necessarily occurred between these two individuals. So they decide that the best thing to do, it seems, is to have both parties take ownership of something they did, even if one party absolutely is not culpable in any way, shape, or form.
It's so insincere anyway.
It's totally insincere. It's extremely performative. And I would imagine quite distressing if somebody were to attack me and I was asked to apologize for my role in what had happened. If I was asked to show like empathy or compassion towards this individual because that's considered to be the collective right thing to do, that would not feel right to me. And that would leave a significant.
I think there's this idea, though, I'm just going to throw this out there, where, if you have a kid that is bullying other children, and that kid, gets in trouble and then has to go to therapy. Okay, let's just say the school, requires that kid goes to some counseling. The counselor, the therapist, is then, in a sense, supposed to dig deep and find a point of compassion for this person who's a bully. Find the point at which, where did the hurt come from in your life that would cause you to hurt other people? That's an oversimplification of what bullying is. And it's an oversimplification. I'm aware of that bullying could have much more to it than just that. And that's not necessarily always the reason. But let's just use that for the sake of argument. So now I, as a therapist, I, as a counselor, need to find a point of compassion for this bully, because this bully clearly has suffered some great hurts and harms and pains that have caused him or her to become, this, antagonistic bully to everybody. At the same time, I'm seeing the victim for therapy too. And I've got to find a way then to connect with her or him or whomever on some level, and draw a sense of empathy, and then educate her on why we should see that bully as a human person that's full of fear and have compassion for him or her. This is very confusing, even as an adult, to be put in that kind of position where you're literally working with both sides. And that's what you're doing in both scenarios, or what you are responsible for doing in both scenarios, according to some ways that psychotherapy is taught. That makes sense? So there is this.
It is just so bizarre.
Yes.
It is just so bizarre.
Yes.
Because a bully can be simultaneously a victim of something.
Yes.
As well as a perpetrator of something else.
Yes. Yes. So
And
you're supposed to hold both, right? How do you hold both of those to be true? That's what we're asking these kids to do. We're asking kids to do that.
Yeah, and that is that is a more mature way of going about this thing, is to, everybody can't be just victims here.
Yes.
There are some perpetrators too.
Yes.
Children aren't just innocent. Look, we're talking about adolescents here. They aren't just innocent. They can be destructive too.
Yes, they can.
And gradually this reality about their potential to be destructive should also be introduced. But empathy everywhere. While they are, you can see the way they respond to offenses, how destructive they are, but their destructiveness is never highlighted, and they're never being held accountable for their destructiveness, because these who are as destructive are also those who cry the loudest, and those who cry the loudest are the biggest victims, and everybody just bends over backwards to accommodate their feelings. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. We're fostering manipulative little narcissists, and they need to appreciate the extent of their destructiveness.
If we're having I mean, in the example that she gave here with this young girl who made some jokes that happened to step on other people's sensibilities, they held an entire school assembly about the harm that this had done. Am I misremembering this?
No,
where she was I don't know if she was disinvited, but she certainly wasn't invited to the assembly, where you're making this big show of you're letting the kids essentially run the show here, because you're, for whatever reason, feeling that the right thing for you to do is to make a big statement about this. Where, Christine, what I hear you describing is that in that individual setting with a therapist, the nuance that can be derived from the interaction can foster that sense of empathy on an individual level, so we can understand, how do we get from point A to point B here? How do we find ourselves here? And how do we get, for the individual who maybe is hurt in this circumstance, how do we get from point B to point C, which maybe is healing or understanding? I think in those circumstances, we're talking about a different dynamic from the collective. She called it the tattletale generation, and I wrote in the book the emotional ammo generation, because it seems to me that what they're teaching kids to do is to store up pieces of information about each other, like bargaining chips, at a time of duress, or convenience. And to say that kids can't see the times in which they can manipulate their environment it's a bold claim, and it's an inaccurate claim. It's completely off base. Absolutely. So I'm going with that for this section, the emotional ammo generation in my book. That's what's really
I like it. I like it very much.
The tattletale generation. Yeah.
The tattletale generation.
It is the emotional ammo, though. That is a really strong, powerful image.
I don't know about you, Michael, but I mean, I think in terms of my and Christine's generation. We're also from different geographical locations, Christine, so I can't assume your background either. But from my background, you know, doing good and to be empathetic and to be on the lookout for the underdog, that used to be a private affair. You were
Mhm.
encouraged to do it, and you would do it on your own, and you would take the initiative. You and your buddies would notice there's a friend sitting on the sideline. You know, let's just invite him in. Let's just make him part of our group. You know, there was no fanfare. There was no declaration of our righteousness because we did this. And because of that, that was sincere, because there was no secondary gain.
Yeah.
The pleasure derived from it was just from doing the act itself, not from the prestige we gained from it.
Yes.
But this generation, Generation Z, you know, many of them are, oh my goodness, let's not get started. Because they grow up in this time where everything is advertised, their righteousness is advertised, it creates a new system of puritanism. Because of
Yes.
that, you know, sincerity is doubted. It's hard to tell whether they do this out of a sincere place or because of the desire to score social brownie points.
Right. And
Because
so
that
they're
is the system within which they're rooted.
right, right. And in some sense, it's their experience has become contaminated by an extra social milieu, an extra cultural milieu of some sort, where there may even be, you know, to some degree, metacognitive processes of, you know what, if I do this particular action, I might experience X, Y, and Z. I might think X, Y, and Z. I might feel X, Y, and Z. Whether or not that's fully conscious for these kids, you know, probably is case dependent. Like all things, it depends. But I
Depends.
think when you see group members getting out of trouble because they, you know, feign a victim status, let's say, when
Yeah.
someone else has truly been victimized, and you're employing this weaponized empathy, what we're really seeing is a manipulation of your environment that can't be undone. It becomes once you set that as a norm, other individuals are going to scaffold off of that as the norm.
Yeah. And the adults play
And
along
then,
with it.
but the adults play
Yes.
along with it.
They don't know of these kids don't know of any better. The world that is being created by them has also been created for them.
Right.
So the last question of this chapter, I think this is a good time to transition, is the obvious next question: who raised these kids? And that ties in to what we'll be covering next time, which is the road paved by gentle parents. That will be our chapter 9.
Great.
Looking
Nice discussion as
forward to it.
always. Thank you for your ideas. Thank you for your thoughts.
Yes, thank you.
Talk to you soon.